What is that? Sex? No. Too complicated. Just put it in the trash. Hey y'all, today is Friday, which means, like every day, it's a great day to unlearn the myths that you've been taught. Today we are going to unlearn the categories of men and women. So around my hometown, the rhetoric that enforces a gender binary, which is derivative of a sex binary, is still super common. And as I've read foundational gender theory texts for my classes in college, I've had to ask why the knowledge that sex is fake was kept from me until I entered a WGSS class in university. And I haven't settled on a sole reason, but I think it largely stems from two influences. First, gender theory is considered highly academic and thus largely inaccessible. It's hard to corrode the notion of a gender binary without operating in the same sphere as the things that enforce it. For example, everyone in my hometown had to take an 8th grade science class, but few of us went on to read Butler's Gender Trouble at college, which I recommend. Though gender theory tackles something important to everybody and to every body, as we all interact with gender inevitably, it remains deeply wedged into syllabi for the eyes of WGSS professors and students only. Furthermore, universities that have access to these written works do not actively spread them, making college a prerequisite for this knowledge. And it leaves those that don't pursue college with antiquated notions of gender because they can't access this information that challenges their assumptions. The second influence, I think, is that medicine and science treat bodies in ways that are convenient, meaning we often see check boxes for sex on our medical forms and in other medical environments, and that reinforces the idea that the sex binary is scientifically and medically supported, which, one, should not be the way that we assess the validity of concepts, and two, is not true, but we'll get to that later. So regardless of the social forces that have carried it, the notion of a sex binary is incredibly flawed. And if we're to overcome our attachment to it, then we need videos like this that showcase the social theory that exposes the flaws. So right now, I'm going to take what I've learned from 4 semesters as a women's gender and sexuality studies major to explain why the categories of men and women aren't real. First, if we're going to dismantle it, it seems necessary to first define sex, which seems easy enough, but this is where we reach our first red flag. Many conversations now converge on either creating a dichotomy of people with XX chromosomes, women, or XY chromosomes, men, or creating a similar dichotomy of people with vaginas, women, or people with penises, men. However, sex can be realized through other aspects of one's body, like internal sex structures they possess, gonads they possess, and the hormones that their body produces. That gives us 5 different definitions for sex, and the kicker is they can all be different in the same individual. For example, an individual could have XX chromosomes, be born with a vagina, have testes present, and produce high levels of testosterone, possibly leading to facial hair and muscle mass, and thus a masculine appearance. An individual may also have XY chromosomes, have a vagina and a clitoris that functions like a penis, have a uterus and ovaries, and have features influenced by estrogen and progesterone like wider hips and breasts that are considered feminine. So that being said, there are 5 different axes for determining sex and at least 2 options on each axis, with obviously more present as hormone levels exist on a sort of continuum, and it's possible to have both or neither of a set of gonads or sex structures. But just using the minimum of 2, that means there are 32 different possible combinations for all of these definitions of sex. The actual diversity of bodies doesn't subscribe to this two-sex dichotomy, and some bodies actively challenge it by being classed differently depending on the tenet of sex that one would use to classify them. Sex is not this clear defining marker like it might seem to be for fertile cis people with commonly accepted sex organs, appropriate hormone levels, and the gender to match. It's much more complicated. You might think at this point, okay, sure, we've established that sex is a really fuzzy, indefinite concept, but surely the medical field has been working on a stable definition, right? To which I would say, absolutely not. For insight on this, we can look to one of my favorite gender theorists, Anne Fausto-Sterling. Well, wait, her wife works at Yale. If I was in the same room as Anne Fausto-Sterling, I think I would be unable to talk. I can never meet your heroes. Never meet your heroes. In one of her pieces, she pinpoints the shift of the treatment of intersex individuals over time through Western medicine. We can start all the way back in ancient Greece, where Aristotle was convinced that intersex babies were a form of twins that occurred, and that their true sex was revealed not by their genitals, but by the heat of their heart. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. I don't know how they were measuring baby heart heat. All hearts are warm. Galen mapped a grid onto the mother's uterus and argued that the place the embryo resides in the uterus would determine sex on a scale of male to female with intermediate stages in between. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and Galen's idea of uterus location determining sex was still prevalent, but it had morphed into a continuum from the cold left side of the uterus generating women to the right warm side generating men, and those that formed in the middle would be what is now considered intersex. We can move forward again to the late 1700s and the rise of biology as a discipline. A physician named Geoffrey St. Hilaire. Is it Jeffrey? That is the worst. That's the worst possible way to spell Jeffrey. Oh no. Geoffroy. I hope it's not Jeffrey. Anyway, he claimed that the births of bodies that were not easily sexed were natural, but simultaneously ruled these bodies as abnormalities in need of study. By his time, the sex binary was already being used socially for the enforcement of gender roles and laws outside of medical practice. This division between sexes as categorical instead of continual was cemented in the 20th century when a two and only two gender system was needed to condemn social radicalism. Out of this came the medical ruling that a body that was not sexed male or female needed to pick, or rather be assigned, whichever was most dominant in their present gonads. As medical technology improved, the age of gonads receded and the age of conversion began, where intersex bodies are identified at birth and often operated on to make them appear in line with a sex. This continues to be the dominant narrative that there is no spectrum of sex, only male or female, and that anyone outside of it is a mistake. But we can see that this rigidity of sex is a fairly new ideology to arise out of social pressures, rather than one rooted in the timeless science of biology. These inconsistencies in the sex binary make it clear that sex is not prediscursive. That means that sex does not exist outside of the discourses that generate it. In simpler terms, if there was not a system in place to articulate sex and enforce it, it wouldn't exist. bodies would just have variation, and sex would not be what defines that variation. Now, you might be clutching your pearls thinking, but Jamie, I like my sex. It makes sense to me. And that's fine, because I'm not saying that prediscursiveness is necessary to use a concept. Time, culture, identity, race, etc. are all built from their own discourse as well, but that doesn't make them invalid. Rather, we need to understand the dangers of treating sex like an infallible, transcendent concept that defines us. J.K. Rowling, please pick up your pencil and start writing. When you assume that a concept is essential and defining because it makes sense to you or to others that you associate with, you risk placing that above people's experiences that are infinitely more important than this abstract concept. See Rowling's tweet. In defending this notion of sex, she asserts that sex is the uniting thing for women to define their experiences. But womanhood and femininity are much more complex than that, and they don't rely on being sexed female at birth. Women's experiences are meaningful as just that because of the shared subordination they face under men, or the ways they construct themselves relative to others, or the societal standards placed on them, but not their sex. Sex is not a necessary precursor to womanhood because they're all culturally co-constructed. Sex is not the real definition of what makes a woman just because some people are attached to their own relationship of sex and identity. This ideology is not just dangerous because it breeds TERFs that don't recognize their own hate. The essentialist ideas that one's sex causes one to act in certain ways or be inherently different from someone of another sex is essential to incel framework. Incels use this genetic essentialism to reduce women to their ability to procreate and allow for rampant assertions that women are collectively not hardwired to love men, but instead to use them. I cannot give any more of my time to incels. It's just really exhausting to talk about, so I'm not going to do it. The point is, sex is not real. It, like many other aspects of being human, is socially constructed. This knowledge doesn't need to break down one's own relationship to sex, but it should encourage us to step away from our need to defend it as this scientific concept separate from our notions of gender. It belongs nestled among our other social conventions and similarly should be critiqued among them. If you still have any questions about sex, please look to the further reading in the description. And I want to give a big thank you to my WGSS professors for helping me to have this nuanced understanding of sex, and also for watching the weird projects like this that come from it. I hope you've enjoyed unlearning with me.